Okay, my honors and American history students, this is the last lecture of the school year for Social Studies 2. Mr. McCaskill's Social Studies 2, anyway. Hopefully you've gotten at least something out of these lectures, and hopefully you find them at least interesting at times. If they have been torture for you, this is the last one. Those of you who found them interesting, I thank you for your comments and your questions, and miss doing this in front of you, to be honest, which is how I'd rather be doing it. But this will be the last one of the year. It'll probably be longer than it should be. Maybe listen to it in parts or multitask and listen to it while you're doing other things. But again, try to use this as a way to enhance your learning. This will be my last explanation of American history to most of you. Most of you I won't have as students again. Hopefully some of you I'll see in my college course in a year or two. Okay, so the primary text sections for this lecture are 17.5, 17.6, and then 18.1 and 18.2. So try to read those if you haven't already. And then, of course, I use various other sources. I had to do a lot of reading on some of these topics this past weekend just to try and learn them a little bit better myself. So we'll see how this lecture goes here. Feel free to, of course, ask questions. You should ask a question and make a comment at the end of this lecture. Please do so. Okay, so I'm going to focus on Bush Sr. a little bit again, mention him in the last lecture, and then again focus on the Clinton presidency and then George W. Bush. So unfortunately, we won't be getting to President Obama this year, but then again, that's probably okay because his presidency is pretty recent, and really the historical evaluations on him need to have some more time to generate, so to speak. More stuff needs to come out and more things need to be written. So it's kind of okay that we're not getting to Barack Obama. Okay, so let's look at George H.W. Bush. So just to remind you of some things about him, these first few slides will be a repeat from the last lecture, kind of reminding you of some things. But George H.W. Bush was elected president in 1988. He's going to preside over the end of the Cold War. And please remember that. Students tend to think of Reagan as being the president when the Cold War ended. Now, Reagan's efforts are definitely key to helping bring about an end to the Cold War, but Bush's efforts shouldn't be slighted either. Bush's steady leadership and continuous meetings with Gorbachev, combined with his experience and expertise in foreign policy, will be key to bringing about the end of the Cold War. Bush had more experience in Cold War than Reagan did and advised Reagan on foreign policy. Bush is a foreign policy expert, to be sure. And his continued pressure on Gorbachev and the Soviet Union and East Germany will help bring about the fall of the Berlin Wall. He's also going to advocate for the reunification of Germany after this. He just doesn't have those big speech moments that President Reagan did. Reagan gave his 1987 Berlin Wall speech, which was great. Bush doesn't really have those, but his steady leadership is a key factor in the Cold War. It really should not be slighted in historical evaluations. Okay, so now remember, the Cold War ended, and a lot of that was due to the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev as well. You had Soviet republics declaring their independence. Countries of the Warsaw Pact nations like Poland had began demanding their independence in the early 80s, and then you had countries that bordered Russia, such as Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and all those nations, wanting their independence as well. They wanted to govern themselves. Okay, and that began happening in the late 80s, going on in the early 90s. That'll lead to Gorbachev's resignation. He'll resign in 1991, and he resigned really due to pressure from both sides of the political aisle. There was a coup from communist hardliners. Now remember, a coup is an attempted overthrow from within, but there were communist hardliners who were upset at Gorbachev's reforms, wanted the Soviet Union to stay around and be a strict totalitarian state still. They tried to overthrow him. That doesn't work, and a lot of the reason that doesn't work is because democratic reformers protested it, but then those democratic reformers put pressure on Gorbachev to resign because they felt like he wasn't going far enough. So he will resign in December of 1991 as the Soviet Union essentially falls apart, and all those Soviet republics end up governing themselves and forming a loose alliance called the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, that affects the United States. That affects the United States because they propose a major decrease in U.S. forces. George H.W. Bush, President Bush, was a fiscal conservative. So he's trying to look, the deficit is incredibly high by the time he takes office, and he wants to reduce it. And it's not unusual to cut the defense budget when wars end, even a cold one. So there were cuts to the Pentagon budget and the closure of hundreds of military facilities under the Base Realignment and Closure Act, and this occurred in the early 1990s. And these cuts will continue despite the Gulf War expenditures. Now, I mentioned the Persian Gulf War in the last lecture. Just let me remind you of some things, do a little bit of review here, maybe some new things about that conflict, because it's going to be important to the content later in this lecture, that content being the Second Iraq War. So let me just remind you of some things with the First Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War. In 1990, Iraq had invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is this tiny country down here, borders the Persian Gulf. Iraq, it's large northwestern border country with Kuwait. So Iraq invaded Kuwait because there were disputes over who controlled what oil, basically. Saddam was saying that Kuwait had once been part of Iraq anyway, and it should be again. So Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. This upset the United States and many countries around the world because there was a fear that Iraq would gain control of much of the world's oil supply, particularly if they threatened Saudi Arabia. So Bush built a coalition, an alliance of nations, and they were pressuring Iraq to leave. Congress gave Bush the authority to use force in January of 1991. Okay, and this force, as you saw on the previous slide and you see here, the name of this military operation will be Desert Storm, Operation Desert Storm. And basically it begins in mid-January with a heavy bombing campaign. February, 200,000 ground forces invade the country or attack Iraq from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is arguably our strongest Palestinian, our strongest Arab ally in the Middle East because of how much oil we purchase from them, quite frankly. So we invade Iraq with 200,000 forces, and the Iraqi resistance is crushed. We liberate Kuwait. It happens pretty quickly. The whole conflict is about 100 days. U.S. troops forced Iraq out of Kuwait. You see in this image here, and these are U.S. troops here. I'm not sure if they're going into battle or coming back from one in this image. But if you see in this image back here, you can see oil wells have been lit on fire. As Iraqi forces retreated out of Kuwait, they lit oil wells on fire as an attempt to slow down U.S. troops. And it will be a pain, to say the least, to put these fires out. Oil fires are very difficult to put out. Now, this war is a popular war in American history for the most part. There are those who criticize George H.W. Bush for leaving Saddam Hussein in power, but the objective of the war, the objective of this conflict, was to remove Iraqi invasion forces from Kuwait, end Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. The mission of this war was not to remove Saddam Hussein from power. And you have to remember what's going on here. Even in 1991, you have to think that Vietnam syndrome, the notion that the United States does not want to get involved in a conflict that it cannot get out of. It does not want to get involved in another quagmire or swamp that it cannot get out of. And so Bush's approval rating is high for this war, very high. It's unusual for a president to have an approval rating of 88%. The mission is accomplished. The war is short, there's few U.S. casualties, and the boys come home and there's victory parades. So his approval rating is very high at 88% after this conflict. And that should cause us to ask a question, because this is, once again, is unusual. I mean, to give you a contrast here, the highest Trump's approval rating has been maybe 54% in his first 3 years. Now, he uses divisive language a lot, so some of his own actions are a factor in that. But this 88%, it's unusual for any president to ever have that high a ranking. Okay, so war ends, high approval rating. How is it that Bush is only a one-term president? Okay, because this is 1991. The election's the next year, right? Well, let's look at the 1992 election. This is an interesting election in that you have three candidates running for office that have a chance. That doesn't usually happen. Usually in a presidential election, there's only two guys who have a chance: the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee. The last time this happened was 1912 when Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson all had a chance of winning. Okay, so in 1912 we had an election with three guys that had a chance of winning. In 1992 we had that same thing. When you go to vote for president, you'll see other candidates on there besides the Republican and the Democratic nominee, but they don't really have a chance. In this election, three guys actually had a chance. It's unusual. It doesn't happen a lot in American history. So, of course, the Republican is George H.W. Bush. Now, why is he not going to win this election? Well, the economy. The economy is going to cause people to not vote for him. So he has a high approval rating coming out of the victory in Iraq. But by 92, about a year later, his approval rating has declined greatly. The federal deficit is at 2.8 trillion, which really isn't his fault. That's more Ronald Reagan's fault. Bush is trying to find ways to reduce it, but nevertheless, the federal deficit is still high. There's a recession that's been going on from 1990 and will continue to go on from 1992, which tells us that war does not always help the economy. There's no money in the federal budget. Now, Bush had promised not to raise taxes, so there's no money in the federal budget to address some of the social issues that the country is facing. There was an increase in homelessness, there was an increase in drug addiction and crime, and once again, some of these are things left over from the previous president, but Bush is dealing with these, and so he's going to be forced to raise taxes. The deficit's getting too high, and he wants to address some of these other social issues. He had campaigned in 1988. He had said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," one of those famous campaign quotes, and then he ends up raising taxes. So that's going to hurt him too. So a recession and going back on that campaign pledge are going to reduce the popularity that he had coming out of the Iraqi conflict. The Democratic nominee is Bill Clinton. He was Arkansas governor prior to running for president. Now, the third guy is Ross Perot, pictured here in the middle. This is one of the debates they had that year. He's an independent, so he's not a member of either party. He's funding mostly his own campaign. He's a Texas businessman. He's a billionaire. He was in charge of, or he was an executive officer of the Electronic Data Systems and Perot Systems Company. Okay, and he may very well have won in 92. His poll numbers were high. He was doing well in debates. He was doing good. But he dropped out about halfway through. And the reason why he dropped out about halfway through was he didn't like the personal scrutiny his family was getting. Well, unfortunately, that's part of running for politics. They're going to scrutinize everything you do, and they're going to dig up dirt and all that stuff, and he didn't like that. Now, he did get back in, so he dropped out, and then he got back in. But dropping out hurt him. The American people were kind of viewing him as maybe a little too indecisive after that. But he might have won. It was a very interesting election year. Now, his campaign still affects the outcome. And here's how it affected it. Clinton is only going to win 43% of the popular vote. Now, of course, if you're a Clinton supporter, you say Perot took votes from him. If you're a Bush supporter, you say Perot took votes from Bush, right? But what we see is Clinton doesn't even win a majority of the popular vote. So it's 43% to 37%. Now Bush defenders say that Perot was more like him in his policies, so he took voters from Bush, and maybe there's some truth to that. Some of Perot's policies were similar to Clinton's, so that's kind of one of the debates about this election. But what we see here is the winning president not winning a majority of the popular vote, which has happened in the last election as well, and will happen in 2000. So it seems to be happening too much lately, the last 20 or so years, 30 years. But he did win, Clinton did win 68% of the Electoral College vote. All these states in blue are the states that Clinton won, and all these states in this color here, kind of red, whatever it is, Bush won. So close election, at least with the popular vote. Three candidates gaining a decent percentage of the popular vote. Unusual. All right, just a brief background of Clinton. He was a governor of Arkansas before he ran for president. He'll be president from 1993 to 2001, so he's going to be a two-term president. Pretty popular president in the United States history, highly rated, but definitely some issues that occurred, including a scandal, which we'll get to. Now, he wins this election probably because of two key things he was promising. One is he was promising to get the country out of the recession, and he was claiming to be a moderate Democrat. So he's going to represent the people in the middle, so to speak. And it may have caused some people who maybe lean right to come over and vote for him as well, who were upset about the economy. So he's vowing to be a moderate Democrat. All right, let's actually start with his struggles before we get to his successes. Now, a key issue that Clinton had to deal with while he was president was the issue of gays in the military. Now, here's the thing. Gays have always served in the U.S. military. If you want to read a great World War II book, one of the best World War II books I've ever read is a book called The Best War Ever by Michael C.C. Adams. And he deals with a lot of things about World War II that most historians know, including the participation of gays in the military. And he provides several stories of how brave gays fought even during World War II. But this was always discouraged, frowned upon, prejudices, all those things. They couldn't serve openly. They couldn't be true to themselves. So this was something that gays were fighting for. And guys, remember, during Vietnam, guys could get out of the draft by just saying they were gay. Okay? So you had people who wanted to serve who maybe were gay and were being denied, and then you had guys lying about it so they get out of the draft. So why this is an issue, I don't know, but anyway, what Clinton decides to do is he decides on don't ask, don't tell. This is seen as a compromise between those who wanted to end the ban on gays in the military and those who felt having openly gay troops would hurt morale and cause problems in military ranks. So those are the two sides of the argument. They could serve under this decision, but they had to be quiet about their sexuality. So once again, they couldn't be who they were, even if they're on leave or whatever. And the thing about this act is, I guess the thing is, it's kind of seen as ending the ban, but it's really doing little to protect gays in the military. And it still led to many expulsions because if a person was openly gay and just trying to be who they were, right, they could still be removed from the military. So it's not seen as, a revolutionary action. Get a lot of criticism. This will be repealed under President Obama in 2010. So now being gay is not a restriction for the military anymore, although I'm sure all the issues have not been solved due to continuing prejudices that just for some reason won't go away. Another struggle that will occur was Hillary Clinton and healthcare. Now, what Clinton did with his wife Hillary was similar to what FDR did with Eleanor Roosevelt. I don't know if you remember the FDR presidency, but Eleanor had a prominent role. She was an advisor to him and really perhaps more of a civil rights leader than FDR was himself. Eleanor had a very active role in FDR's presidency. He could go where he couldn't because remember he had polio and all those things. And that's what Bill Clinton did with his wife Hillary. He basically made her in charge of coming up with a health care proposal from the executive branch. And that proposal is very similar to what the Affordable Care Act was, very similar to what some governors like Mitt Romney ended up proposing in Massachusetts, plans that ended up being successful. But this is going to have well-organized opposition. Republicans were attacking it as big business, or as big government, I should say, and it never reached the floor for a vote. So the plan was put together, argued for, of course, but never voted on by Congress. So the issue of universal health care remains an issue, even now, with the Affordable Care Act. Okay, Clinton's successes. What is he successful at as a president? Why is he highly rated as a president? Under Bill Clinton, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act passes, and obviously gun control is a heavily debated issue in the United States. But what that did, it passed in '93, was it brought about a background check when purchasing a firearm. So now when you go to purchase a firearm, there's a background check. It used to take 5 days for that, but I do think it's quicker now. And this was actually named after Reagan's Secretary of State, James Brady, who during the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, he was shot and suffered permanent paralysis and brain damage as a result. So that's why that act came about, and it's named after him. Another successful act that Clinton was able to get through was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. This was passed in 1996. This is often labeled as welfare to work. And what this act did was move millions from welfare to jobs because it put limits on how long you could be on welfare. It provided incentives to be looking for work, some job training programs, things like that. And what's interesting about these two acts is maybe this one more so than this one, although I'd have to look at the voting totals, is what Clinton is able to do while he's president, and the reason why he's viewed as a successful president is he's able to get bipartisan support for a lot of the acts that get through. And indeed, he'll have to, because through much of his presidency, he's dealing with a Republican Congress. Not the first 2 years, but after that, he will. So he's got to work with the other side to get things through. And probably the most successful thing that he's able to do as president, and this really affects his evaluation, at least domestic success, is the economy, but also the budget. So the economy and budget were the long-term successes of the Clinton presidency. His early budget focus is deficit reduction. Remember, the deficit was the highest the deficit had ever been since World War II. At this point, it's actually higher now, but it will be reduced under the Clinton presidency. He's basically going to win. Sources talk about he wins the budget wars. And in this photo here, what's interesting is you've got bipartisan support. Newt Gingrich will be a prominent Republican senator, okay? And then you've got his vice president here, Al Gore. This is a Democratic senator back here whose name I'm forgetting. Sorry about that. But this is a bipartisan budget plans. And what we'll see is the first budget surpluses in years, okay? Meaning the government is actually taking in more money than it is spending. So I want to repeat this. The Clinton and Republican-controlled Congress agreed in 1997 on legislation to balance the budget. The bill cut spending, lowered taxes, but still included programs aimed at helping children and improving health care. So what we see is a bipartisan bill, okay? That's right, kids. At one time in this country, both parties worked together to accomplish things. And this is what usually leads to high presidential ratings, presidents that are able to get these things done. Now, I mentioned that the economy was booming. Just some stats for that. Unemployment in 1992 was at 7.5%. By 2000, will be down to 4%. The stock market, remember the Dow Jones is a measure of prominent companies with major stocks. So when you see that Dow Jones, it's a measure based on, I want to say 25 companies, but don't quote me on that. It's probably much more than that. But it's a measure of major companies and how their stocks are doing. So when Dow goes up, that means the value of their stocks are going up. 1991, it was at 3,000. By 2001, it's almost 12,000. And a good sign of an economy, of course, is unemployment. We see the unemployment rate up here. I mentioned that about 7.5%. And then we see that decline here. We do see it go up again in the early 2000s under Bush Jr.'s presidency. Some of that will be, of course, due to 9/11, but also in 2008 when he leaves office, we're experiencing the Great Recession. Now, it's not all about Clinton, and sometimes you can debate how much impact a president actually has on the economy. But I think it's fair to say that presidential and congressional policy does affect the economy. But what we also see in the 90s is the dot-com revolution and high tech were seen as the future of the U.S. economy. So this is when the internet is exploding, right? And you've got Silicon Valley in California, and you've got all these tech companies that are really taking off and hiring a lot of people and things like that. So that's obviously another key factor to the economy in the 1990s. The GDP, the value of goods and service produced in the United States, grew steadily throughout the 1990s. So our value of our goods and services, the products, the services we're providing that continued to grow steadily throughout the 1990s. NAFTA also passes under Clinton. Now, NAFTA is another bipartisan bill. It was actually proposed by George H.W. Bush. It will pass under Bill Clinton. So this is an act that gets support from both sides of the aisle, although not everybody on both sides of the aisle. Labor politicians who favor labor groups are upset about this. It does some good things and it does some bad things. Basically, it ends trade barriers between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So those three countries, our northern neighbor and our southern neighbor, right? Trade increases greatly, sharing of products increases greatly, and that can actually help a lot of segments of the economy, and that can actually create jobs in a lot of instances. But it hurts manufacturing jobs in the United States because what happens is you see some factories, some auto factories in particular, relocating to Mexico because they can pay their laborers uh, less wages to do that. So we see a decrease in manufacturing jobs in the United States. We saw that under Reagan with companies going to China, and now we're seeing it happening under Clinton with companies going to Mexico. What's interesting about NAFTA to me is it is trying to improve labor safety and it's trying to improve environmental protections in these factories, even in Mexico where they were poor. But we do see it hurting the jobs that exist in the United States, and we see a decline in manufacturing, which leads us to some holes in the new economy. And this is a little bit of a repeat because I think I brought this up with the economy of the 80s. The new types of jobs that were coming about in the 80s and 90s are more service based, right? Less manufacturing, more service based jobs, more retail sales and fast food jobs. So the era of like my dad graduating high school in 1960 and getting a factory job and getting great pay and being able to put his kids through college and all those things, we're seeing those jobs go away and people are entering more and more service type jobs, okay, that are lower paying. Now, once again, there are some high paying service jobs, but those require additional training. Those require education, right? You need a college degree typically to get a high paying service industry job. And racial minorities continue to face higher jobless rates. Typically, what we see in the United States is that racial minorities have twice the unemployment rate of whites. And so unemployment dropped to 4% under Clinton. That meant that African Americans and Hispanics was probably still at 8. And what we want, now the reason why that stat comes up is what we want if we're truly trying to be the best democracy on the planet, live up to the ideals of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness as stated in Declaration of Independence, what we want is we want to see those percentages evened out. Okay, so where everybody has 4% unemployment. That's the ideal, that's the goal anyway. But due to prejudiced practices in the past and the legacy of racism and poverty, we continue to see things like this. Okay, and the gap between the rich and the poor continued to widen. It began widening under Reagan, continued under Bush, and it was really continuing under Clinton, something that was not going away. Where the wealth that was being generated by this economy, there was a big gap between the rich and the poor, and maybe a tightening of the middle class somewhat. Okay, I'm going to move on to foreign policy with Clinton now. Okay, so Clinton is dealing with, and foreign policy is pretty important because your last test essay is dealing with foreign policy. It's dealing with a military involvement. I'll bring up one with Clinton as one of the choices of that last essay here in a moment. But Clinton is dealing with the end of the Cold War, and for the most part, his foreign policy is either a mixed review or a good review. Like his foreign policy is usually highly rated. Cooperation with Russia on economics and arms control issues continued post-Cold War. Permanent trade rights with China are established post-Cold War. And a thing that is seen as what we see with Clinton and perhaps with George H.W. Bush with some of his involvements, what we see is where we're being a very strong humanitarian force in the world. And a good example of that is Haiti. Now, Haiti is a Caribbean island. It borders the Dominican Republic. It's close to Cuba, so it's not that far from us. What had happened in Haiti was a military takeover of the country. The Democratic governor or the Democratic government in Haiti had been overthrown by a military coup, and Clinton proved willing to send U.S. troops to end conflicts like this. Now, Haiti's pretty close to us, and we want to preserve democracy in our hemisphere, right? So we sent troops into Haiti. The military leaders in Haiti were overthrown. The democratic government there was reestablished in 1991. So that's early in Clinton's presidency. And that was directly affecting us because what was happening is maybe similar to what happened when Castro came to power in Cuba, is thousands of refugees had fled Haiti and they were trying to get to the United States in makeshift rafts and things like that, and very hazardous. So this was a humanitarian thing to do, the right thing to do to restore democracy in Haiti. And we do that in 94. The overthrow had occurred in 91. We restored democracy in 94. Okay? The Somalian Civil War. Another key event to mention, U.S. troops came under fire in the African country of Somalia. So Somalia is in Africa. Now, they had actually been sent there as a peacekeeping force by President George H.W. Bush, so the Bush president before Clinton, right? They had been sent there as a humanitarian to provide humanitarian aid, a peacekeeping force during the Somali Civil War. That Somali Civil War was causing great famine in the country. So President Bush, and by the way, both Bush presidents have a strong record on helping Africa. They both do. So several U.S. troops are sent to Somalia to just try and keep peace, not necessarily get involved, help with the famine, but several U.S. troops will be killed, and Americans were shocked to see Somali rebels dragging the body of 2 U.S. servicemen through the streets. And this is going to happen early in the Clinton presidency, and this will influence a later decision by President Clinton to not get involved in a genocide that was occurring in Rwanda. The Hutus there were slaughtering the Tutsis. Kind of funny names, I guess, but incredibly tragic event. The Hutus had killed 500,000 to 1 million Tutsis simply because of their ethnicity. And Clinton decides not to get involved in this. And this will be the biggest regret of his presidency in terms of foreign policy. He'll actually say that. That was my biggest foreign policy regret, was not ending the genocide in Rwanda. And, you got to think once again, I guess, the Vietnam syndrome. It might have been a situation where Clinton was afraid we get involved there and we can't get out. But something seen as maybe something we should have gotten involved with to end a genocide that was going on there. Okay, and maybe Clinton's greatest foreign policy success, although he was also successful in the Middle East in negotiating the Oslo Accords in 1993, but maybe his greatest foreign policy success was ending ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, Bosnia and Herzegovina is in the Balkans or in Eastern European nations, okay, Eastern European area. You can see Italy here, and you can see these Eastern European nations here. Now, these ones that are colored here, this is what Yugoslavia used to be. When the Cold War ended, Yugoslavia fell apart, and it fell apart often violently. And what happened is you had 5 nations emerge from the former Yugoslavia. Those nations were Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. I know there's 2 names there, but that's what this country is called, Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's the name of it. Serbia, and then down here, a little bit cut off, Macedonia. An ethnic cleansing was occurring in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Basically what happened, and please read these text sections, you'll get more of the story, but basically what happened is Serb militias, so militias from Serbia, had gone into Bosnia and Herzegovina. They were expelling people from their homes, people of certain ethnic groups. They were killing people of certain ethnic groups. They were led by Slobodan Milosevic. I'll make sure I'm getting that right, and it's not the next event, but anyway, sorry for that pause there. But they had gone into the capital, these Serbian militias had gone into the capital of Sarajevo, and they're just slaughtering people because of their ethnicity. It's an ethnic cleansing, horrible thing. So what the United States did is they helped negotiate a cessation to that event in 1995 in what was known as the Dayton Peace Accords. Now, we also had to send U.S. troops there with NATO troops to help police the situation, to just end it, to prevent the killing. About 5,000 people had been killed by the time we got there. Now, in 1999, a similar event occurs in Kosovo, which is part of Serbia. I don't know if you can see it down here, but in southern Serbia is Kosovo. And what Clinton does here, what happens here is Serb forces are carrying out another ethnic cleansing of Albanians, this time in Kosovo. And what Clinton did here is he's able to end this ethnic cleansing just through bombing. And this is seen as a successful thing because there was a concern that critics were saying, you're going to have to send troops in, you're going to have to send troops in. Clinton did not want to send troops into Serbia. He was afraid, once again, it would be a conflict, it would be difficult to get out. But he's able to end that ethnic cleansing through just bombing. Okay? So that is seen as a successful event. And what we're seeing here is the right thing to do. We're ending genocides or attempted genocides in these regions. And this is an instability we help bring about with ending the Cold War, so maybe there's a little bit of obligation here. This is a NATO event. This is a UN event. We're part of those organizations. We're leaders in those organizations, so we got involved there. So U.S. troops remained in both Bosnia and Kosovo as a peacekeeping force. U.S. troops remained as part of a UN peacekeeping force. There are still U.S. troops in Kosovo. So even now, there are still U.S. troops in Kosovo. They're just stationed there to help keep peace. They were pulled out of Bosnia in 2004. So you can see why, and it doesn't mean there wasn't some criticism of these events that occurred at the time, but you can see why Clinton's foreign policy is largely seen as successful, because what he's doing is he's improving U.S. standing around the world, right? He's raising U.S. prestige by ending these conflicts, getting involved in these things and being more humanitarian. You got to think about our prestige at the beginning of the Cold War, coming out of World War II, when we did things like the Berlin Airlift. This is similar to that. We're increasing U.S. We're using our power on the side of good here in a lot of these instances. Getting involved in Haiti and getting involved in this region isn't necessarily doing a lot for us, resource-wise or furthering our interests, but it's the right thing to do. Okay, now let's talk about Clinton's scandal. Now, you did an activity where you had to pick a scandal and argue that it was the worst in United States history, and a few you chose this one. And I'm going to try and bring up at the end of this why I think you did so, and you did a good job with it, those that did. There's, of course, Joe's Watergate and some of the other scandals that were on that list. But Clinton's issue as a president was marital infidelity. He just seemed to be getting involved in sexual harassment issues with women, or being involved with women that weren't his wife. It's a negative aspect of his life, I guess you could say, his involvement in politics. So, reports of marital infidelity will surround him throughout his political career. And he was first accused of sexual harassment by Paula Jones, and this actually occurred in 1994. Remember, he was elected in 1992. Jones said that while he was governor, he had sexually harassed her while she was a state employee in Arkansas. Clinton, to this day, still denies this. While he was president, he did have an affair with Monica Lewinsky. He will later admit to this. Okay, he denied it at first, but then he admitted to an inappropriate relationship with Monica Lewinsky, who was a White House intern. And this is really the issue with this whole scandal, is denying and then admitting. Because when he first denied the charges, he denied them under oath. He was under investigation, so he lied under oath. That's perjury, right? So he's going to be accused of perjury and obstruction of justice, which is going to lead to his impeachment. Bill Clinton will be the second president in United States history to be impeached. There have only been three. There was Andrew Johnson, who was impeached due to the Tenure of Office Act, a violation of that. Clinton will be impeached due to perjury and obstruction of justice. And the same thing is going to happen to Trump, who will be impeached largely due to obstruction of justice, but also trying to bring in a foreign power to influence the upcoming election. None of those presidents will be removed from office. Okay, the Senate will acquit or vote to not remove any of those presidents. You have to have a 2/3 vote to do so. So the House of Representatives voted to impeach Clinton. Once again, the charges were perjury and obstruction of justice, but there were not enough votes to remove Clinton from office. There'll be 2 votes, and each time only about half of the Senate voted to remove Clinton. It was mostly partisan. There were some Democrats who voted for it, and there were some Republicans who voted against it. So it wasn't strictly partisan. Comparison to that, the recent Trump vote, there was only one Republican who went against Trump, and that was Mitt Romney. So that was largely a partisan vote. But you need 2/3 and only about half the vote. So it really wasn't even close to remove Clinton from office. However, the scandal will hurt his image and it will hurt his political power. And I'll try and explain a little bit of that and the legacy of the scandal here. What's interesting about the Clinton impeachment is that his approval rating, so in other words, opinion polls, actually raised for him. He remained a popular president. Look at some of his foreign policy successes, the economy, and so on and so forth. Likable personality to many people. A lot of people saw this as a political attack, trying to remove Clinton, because he's so popular and all those things. But I think sometimes people forget how tough this scandal can be on the women involved. And what they're called by the press. I mean, if you look at the name of the scandal, I'm going to go back to that slide. It's typically called the Lewinsky scandal. Why is it not called the Clinton scandal? Maybe it is now, but during the time, that's not what it was called. It was called the Lewinsky scandal. She was vilified in the press. She was attacked, called all kinds of names. And this is what hurts women who are involved in these. I think sometimes people forget that this could be seen as a man of power taking advantage of this woman who obviously liked him, right? And it was consensual, but why is it the woman who always seems to be vilified in the press was kind of a key issue. I think sometimes people forget that, and I think what some of my students argued, and I thought you did a good job with this, and some of the sources argue, is that the seriousness of this scandal is how men in power often use that power to take advantage of women. And I think that's particularly poignant, and it's become an issue again with some recent documentaries that have been released with the Me Too movement. Men in power tend to be protected. I mean, yeah, Clinton was impeached, but he didn't lose his office, right? And the consequences for Monica Lewinsky were pretty devastating. So I think people need to keep that in mind when these things occur. Now, for Democrats, the what could have been question here is interesting because Clinton was tremendously popular. Even with the scandal, he remained popular, but it definitely hurt him politically. The Republican Congress cooperated with him less after this. It was more difficult for him to get things done. A lot of people think it hurt Al Gore's chances of being president in the next election. So there's a missed opportunity here due to lack of morality. How great could Clinton have been as a president if he would just had a higher moral standard when it came to interacting with women? Okay? All right, so that brings us to the 2000 election. I mentioned that the 1992 election was interesting because you had 3 candidates running for office that had a chance of winning. What makes the 2000 election very interesting is it's one of the closest, if not the closest, presidential election in United States history. So what you have is George W. Bush, son of George H.W. Bush, running for president. He was the governor of Texas prior to this. And he'll be running against Al Gore. Al Gore is the Democratic nominee. He's Clinton's vice president. He's a former representative and senator from Tennessee, son of a senator from Tennessee, Al Gore Sr., who had had the same positions in Tennessee. He had been representative and senator. So once again, Al Gore gets the nominee. He had been from the Democratic Party. He had been Clinton's vice president. Now, this election is incredibly close. and the outcome will be uncertain. And the outcome will largely be uncertain due to the state of Florida, which seems to always screw up close elections. If you look at U.S. history, they screwed it up way back in 1876 too with Rutherford B. Hayes. Anyway, so this is going to be the closest election in U.S. presidential history, at least one of the closest. In 1960 with JFK and Nixon is incredibly close as well. The night of the election, most of the major news networks are declaring Al Gore the winner. But they're going to have to recant that to closure text or retract those statements and say, whoops, maybe not. We're not sure if Gore is going to win. And really the key state is Florida, where the electoral vote was unclear. Now you see a lot of red here for Bush, but the blue for Gore are states that are districts that are more populated, so they're carrying more electoral clout here. Okay, and if you look here, right, the vote in Florida is 49% to 49%, right? So Florida is the key. So what happened? This can be difficult to explain. I'll do my best. Basically, there were problems in Florida. There was a confusing ballot in Palm Beach County. Basically, voters protested when they hit the punch card. They thought they were voting for Bush or Gore, and they were voting for the other guy because it was like off. Like they punched in Gore and they had actually voted for Bush because the lines weren't matching up with the holes that they punched. And you can see this is a famous photo from this election in which this man is very much examining and trying to exactly determine who this person voted for. So many punch card ballots will be rejected. Gore is demanding a recount, which is not unusual. When an election is really close, usually the other person demands a recount. That's happened quite frequently in United States history. So a recount does occur because of the razor-thin margin of victory in Florida for Bush. The Florida State Supreme Court allowed the recount to continue. Bush appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court. So there is a manual recounting that's occurring. The manual recounting results are unclear. The Republican Florida Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, I notice she's a Republican. It was also interesting, so there's some controversy here because Jeb Bush, Bush's brother, was the governor of Florida at the time, so there's definitely some controversy in this election. But anyway, the Republican Florida Secretary of State of Florida, Katherine Harris, declares Bush the winner. It goes to the Supreme Court. The result is a 5-4 decision in favor of Bush, so even the court was really divided here. And Gore concedes. So once that decision comes down from the Supreme Court on December 12th, right? So almost a month after more than a month, about a month and a half after the actual election day, Gore concedes victory. So interesting election, that's for sure. Here's an electoral map. You can see the incredibly close popular vote. What's interesting about this election is that we see, once again, the president, the guy that wins, Bush wins, but he did not win the popular vote. That just happened with Trump in 2016. Now, this is incredibly close, right? So, yeah, Bush doesn't win the popular vote, but look how close it is, right? Trump in 2016 lost the popular vote by about 3 million. So that's even more upsetting to some people who would like to see the Electoral College gotten rid of. If you look at the Electoral College, look how close that is. 1% margin. Good gravy, that's a close election. Okay? Now, people are upset about the popular vote being overruled by Electoral College at least twice in the 21st century. I'm thinking it's time for the Electoral College to go away. The argument for the Electoral College is you don't want just the most populated states determining every election and the less populated states being ignored. Now, of course, if you're a populated state, maybe you're a little bit tired of Montana and the Dakotas determining who your president is or having more of a say than they should. So it's a debate that goes back and forth. One of the other things the Electoral College is supposed to do is make sure that a good president gets elected. It's debated whether or not they ever actually carry out that function. Okay. So like Clinton, let's take a look at some Bush presidency successes, and then we'll close with his foreign policy, and then I'll be done. And kids, there are still things I'm leaving out. There's a lot of things I could be bringing up. I know that seems like it's impossible when these lectures are this long, but there are definitely things I'm leaving out. Anyway, so Bush presidency successes. There'll be some what he called real educational reform that came through. Now, the reason why I've got successes in quotes here is unlike Clinton, Bush is not, and of course it's early yet, his presidency wasn't that long ago, but he's not a highly rated president. The reason why he's not a highly rated president is because there's two wars he started that at least one was controversial, and the '08 recession. He left us with the second worst economic downturn in United States history, although this coronavirus may be overtaking that. We'll have to wait and see. Depends how long it lasts. Anyway, so his successes are kind of in quotes because even these things are somewhat controversial. He's not seen as a president with a lot of successes, but there are people who can defend that, spreading democracy. Perhaps his aid to Africa was a strong point of his presidency. But anyway, No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind is something that you kids are currently subject to, because what No Child Left Behind did is it called for mandatory testing of basic skills at select grade levels. So this act is essentially why we have so much testing today. Most people feel too much. It's based on standards established by each state. Later, it will be based on standards established by the Common Core, which is national standards. A school is judged to be whether or not it needs to have corrective actions taken based on scores on these texts. Parents can literally pull students out of poor performing schools. Funding is based on these tests. So there's a lot of problems to it, and it doesn't really seem like it's done much to help the schools that need the most help. Typically, those are urban schools that are dealt with so many obstacles. So there's criticism of this act because it hasn't really done much to help schools that need improving. The disparities that existed when it was passed still exist today. But one thing to praise about it is it has caused schools to pay attention to how it's serving all their students, including minorities, gifted, people with learning disabilities. So it's not just an overall measure. It breaks down measures into subgroups of kids, which is valuable data for schools. So that's one nice thing that's come about out of No Child Left Behind. There's a tax cut that occurs in 2001. Once again, tax cuts can be good for the American people, can cause sometimes an uptick in the economy. But there was seen as a lack of vision, like it was just tax cuts for tax cuts. The criticism of Bush economically is there never seemed to be like a cohesive vision of what we're going to do with this. They just seemed to be maybe a little bit of some of the criticism that we saw with Carter, where he was just trying different things, and there didn't seem to be any set vision. And what's going to happen is that '08 Great Recession by the end of his presidency, which of course is troubling. And what's happening here is we're seeing more tax cuts that seem to be primarily benefiting the rich. Once again, they were tax cuts for everyone, but tax cuts that were the highest percentages went to the rich again. Okay. Now, of course, when you're talking about the Bush presidency, you have to mention September 11th, 2001. This is the defining event of his presidency. For my generation, this is my Pearl Harbor, right? An attack upon the United States. Kids, maybe your Pearl Harbor, I don't know, maybe is this coronavirus due to the amount of death that it's caused and the transformation that it's caused in our society and economy right now that we'll have to get through. Maybe in some respects, these are similar events. This event was something I personally experienced. We watched it all day on CNN in my classroom when it occurred. It was shocking. It's just one of those defining moments in American history. I remember no planes in the skies for like 3 days after this and things like that. There's just so many things you remember. I also remember the heroism of the American people in this, and that really sticks out to me. But 9/11, this picture is pretty shocking. This is an image. At this point, one plane has already crashed into one of the World Trade Center towers. This one is about to. What an iconic image, a horrifying image. But basically what happened is 19 Arab terrorists hijacked 4 commercial jets, used them as missiles, literally missiles, to destroy predetermined targets. Those were the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. Those are the targets. The Pentagon. The plane also crashed in the Pentagon. And there was a fourth plane that, due to the bravery of the people on board, will crash in a field near Pittsburgh. The people basically rushed the terrorists, and the terrorists just decided to crash it, apparently in a field in Pittsburgh. We don't really know where that was headed. Maybe it was headed to the White House. We really don't know. But these towers, the Twin Towers, will collapse within about 2 hours of the attacks, and 3,000 people will be killed. President Bush really found his voice in visiting Ground Zero. He's never known as a great speaker, but he did a great job on 9/11 when he went down there and rallied the rescuers and encouraged them and praised their courage and the courage and the selflessness and the noble actions of New York firefighters and police forces in this is just phenomenal. It was to quote your text, it was a testament to the human spirit. I mean, these firemen ran into these building burnings. I mean, they just trying to save people, and entire squads of firefighters will be lost. The rescuers will work around the clock. There'll be volunteers from around the country that'll assist in many ways. I remember a story about, more blood being donated than what they could possibly use. And sadly, the reason for that is the rescue efforts went on. The realization was that there weren't going to be a lot of survivors. And basically, Ground Zero, as this was called, turned into a search for bodies to recover. So it's an understatement to say it's one of the more tragic events in United States history. In some respects, we've been very fortunate in that we've had very few attacks on our mainland, really overall. I mean, since the War of 1812. I mean, the Civil War occurred, of course, but that was us fighting each other. Hawaii was attacked in 41, but we've had very few attacks on our mainland, but this was shocking. So, and now Bush gives a speech here, and you can see he's giving it with a bullhorn. And he closes this speech, and it's a good speech, encouraging people, praising their efforts, all those things. But he closes it with this line: "Those who perpetrated this will hear from us soon," meaning those who carried out this attack were going to be attacked by the United States. Okay. Congress will give Bush authority to use force in response to these attacks. And you see a picture of his cabinet here. Key people, I'm not going to point out everybody, but key people to point out in planning attacks on Afghanistan and Iraq will be his Secretary of State, Colin Powell, his Vice President, Dick Cheney, his National Security Advisor, who will later become Secretary of State when Colin Powell resigns, Condoleezza Rice, and then Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Of course, there's President Bush himself. So he's going to be given authority by Congress to carry out attacks to those who carried out the 9/11 attacks. It is determined that Al-Qaeda, operating out of Afghanistan and led by Osama bin Laden, was responsible. The last time we heard from Osama bin Laden was when he was fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen. But he is going to become a leader and one of the founders of Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda is a global militant, keyword, militant Islamist organization dedicated to ridding the Middle East of Western influence. So they want the United States out of the Middle East. They want European powers out of the Middle East. They are nationalists, right? Osama bin Laden is actually a billionaire. He's rich, and descended from a rich family in Saudi Arabia. So he's able to fund this and help found it and plan its attacks. In Afghanistan, Afghanistan is ruled by the Taliban in 2001. They are a strict fundamentalist Islamic regime governing Afghanistan, and they allow Al-Qaeda to operate and plan their attacks and train for them. As a consequence, they're going to be attacked. So let's look at our responses to 9/11. One of the key responses to mention is the USA Patriot Act. Excuse me. This gave the federal government the power to conduct search and surveillance of suspected terrorists. Now, critics of this act are concerned about amendment violations as it was discovered that Bush had ordered the NSA, which is a national security agency, to spy on American citizens' international telephone calls and emails without obtaining warrants. So the Patriot Act has got some criticism over the years. It's that old balance in a democracy, security and freedom, right? I mean, sometimes people get in trouble if they say the wrong thing in an email, even if they're not a terrorist, right? So that's a concern. Balancing security and freedom, always a concern in a democracy. The United States will invade Afghanistan. That will be called Operation Enduring Freedom. They're going to invade within 2 months of, it'll take 2 months, and the Taliban will be driven from power. But Osama bin Laden will remain at large. The Department of Homeland Security will be formed. The Department of Homeland Security is designed to analyze threats and protect the nation's borders. And the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, will be formed. Those of you that fly, you've dealt with them. It takes longer to get on planes now. There's more stricter searches. You can bring less on planes now than what you used to be able to bring. Okay, so the attack on Afghanistan literally occurs within a few weeks of September 11th. It happens very quickly, and it only takes 2 months before the Taliban is driven from power. But once again, Osama bin Laden is at large. Now, there are some criticisms, of course, some things that are done after Afghanistan and Iraq, which I'll get to in a moment, in that, we're supposed to be a democratic nation, and we're not supposed to do the things that, fascist nations do. Detainees, suspected terrorists that'll be captured in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I'll get to in a moment. Bush will declare them not subject to the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions occurred after World War II. Those occurred in Geneva, Switzerland. They were meant to prevent things like the Holocaust from occurring again. So what those conferences determined was that there should be certain rules for treatment of combatants, civilians, POWs during times of war, and that if you violate those rules, if you treat people inhumanely, you can face consequences as a leader in a nation. Of course, you got to lose the war for that to typically happen. So what we see is some torture that did occur of suspected terrorist supporters, Iraqi and Afghan civilians. We see torture occur of these groups of people, and we see that happening here. A person forced to stand up here, hold his arms out for a very long time. Not sure what's going on with the wires there. Haven't researched it. But basically what happened is a lot of times these Islamic people were forced to do things that were against their religion. Waterboarding occurred. Things that could be seen as a violation of our Bill of Rights. Now, these aren't American citizens, so there's debates here, right? Terrorists had attacked the United States. The other thing about torture is it definitely has mixed results. I mean, you watch a movie and torture occurs and a person confesses right away. It usually doesn't work that way. There's been some good books written on this by ex-CIA, retired CIA, FBI people. Well, probably just CIA. But there's been some good books written on this, how the best way to get information from people is actually to treat them humanely. Like when you torture them, they tend to give you false information because they just want the torture to stop. So the effectiveness of torture is heavily debated and can be criticized when a democratic leader in the United States, the values that it has, is allowing it to occur. We see, this is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, where some of this torture may have occurred. We still have a military base in Cuba, even though it's ruled by, it's a communist nation. And then another base, another prison we had was in Abu Ghraib, Iraq. All right, I'm going to show you this map as I transition to Iraq, which will be the last thing I'm going to talk about today. But I thought I would show you this map because Afghanistan is very interesting. And what we see happening with George W. Bush is perhaps not learning from the Vietnam Syndrome or ignoring the Vietnam Syndrome. Because what has happened with Afghanistan and Iraq is we've remained involved. And you may remember one of the lessons of Vietnam was we don't want to get involved in a conflict that we can't get out of. Now, Afghanistan, U.S. forces going in Afghanistan is less controversial than Iraq, which is over here. because of Al Qaeda and the Taliban harboring terrorists and all that stuff. Most Americans have supported that, although some people in hindsight say we shouldn't have occupied Afghanistan. We should have just gone after Osama bin Laden and the special forces. But it wasn't as controversial at the time because the American people were so angry about 9/11, right? Iraq over here, which is actually a pretty big nation, it's cut off in this map, kind of goes down over here like this. Iraq has been more controversial because there's some debate as to whether or not the United States should have gotten involved there, which I'll try to get into. What makes Afghanistan tough is because it's landlocked, and there's a lot of mountains in Afghanistan. You may remember the Soviet Union, which is up here, right, had gone into Afghanistan in 1979 and was defeated, similar to what happened to us in Vietnam. They were involved there for about 10 years, and they had to leave without victory. That happened to us in Vietnam. We go into Afghanistan. We've tried to do regime change there, tried to make it a democracy. There's still conflict occurring even now in Afghanistan. Taliban has made a comeback recently. The Islamic State has been involved. So there's kind of like this feeling like, are we ever going to get out of there, right? In Iraq, kind of the same thing. You know, are we involved in quagmires again? Afghanistan is tough. Landlocked, a lot of mountains. Okay. All right. So Iraq. Why do we get involved in Iraq? Well, President Bush, in his State of the Union speech in 2002, and remember, Afghanistan only took 2 months, but we're still kind of involved there. Things aren't entirely peaceful there. He uses this phrase axis of evil. And some historians are like, you're trying to create like a World War II situation, axis powers, you know, interesting term to bring up there. Evil, you know, defining the enemy as evil, right? A lot of presidents like to do that. We're the good guys or the bad guys, right? But what he says is Iraq, Iran, and North Korea are all nations that are creating weapons of mass destruction, all nations that sponsor terrorists, right? And what Bush has declared at this point is a war on terror. So the United States is involved in a war on terror, which we're still involved in. It's a war that will, quite frankly, never end. Some people view it as an excuse to constantly fund the military and to make profit through military production of weapons, because there's always been terrorism. Terrorism will really never end. You know, as long as you're involved in other people's nations and trying to control what they do, there's going to be people who react against you. Okay, whether it's Native Americans in the late 1800s or people from the Middle East or radical groups in the Middle East now. Anyway, what scared people about this speech was, oh my gosh, he's going to go to war with 3 countries. Now, he only ends up going to war with Iraq. And here's the arguments that President Bush and his cabinet made. They argued that Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq, remember, he'd been defeated in 1991 by U.S. forces. George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's dad, did not go into Iraq and try to remove him. They just drove him out of Kuwait. Bush is saying, Bush Jr. now, George W. Bush is saying that he has weapons of mass destruction. Now, after the 1991 Persian Gulf War, the United Nations imposed sanctions against Iraq and called for inspectors, okay, to go into the country at periodic times. And that was basically part of the deal. Part of the deal of ending the war in 1991 was that Hussein had to agree to weapons inspections. But there were times where he was not being cooperative, and he wasn't being as cooperative as he should be in 2002. But what the United Nations is saying, hey, when we went in before, we didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. Let us go in. We don't want to call for force. So this is not going to be a United Nations effort. This is the United States essentially going alone with a few alliances like Great Britain, but you're not going to see the coalition that was built in 1991 by Bush's dad. Nevertheless, Congress still gave Bush authority to invade Iraq in 2002. Colin Powell made a big presentation to the United Nations, to Congress, say, hey, they're making weapons of mass destruction, and we need to go in. And so that does occur in 2002. So U.S. troops invade in 2003, March 19th of 2003. Baghdad falls pretty quickly. Again, you know, Saddam Hussein has a decent military, but not like the United States, right? So Baghdad fell. Saddam Hussein is captured. You see him here bearded and looking pretty raggedy, right? He was actually found in what they call the spider hole. He had fled from the capital. Bush declares an end to major combat operations on May 1st, but that is kind of seen as a little bit presumptuous. He kind of gets made fun of for that now. It's kind of like his victory speech, cheerleader moment. He's on a ship in the Persian Gulf here, big mission accomplished sign, right? He gets some criticism from that now, because to assume that the war was over then, or that combat might be over then, was going a little bit too far. Because just because the government wasn't overthrown doesn't mean that the United States still wasn't going to face opposition forces in Iraq, and indeed we still continue to do so at times. Okay, so Iraq War consequences. And this could be one of the topics you choose for your last essay, as well as Afghanistan. So maybe my lecture on this will help you with that. The duration of the war. So the war itself, it lasted, you go to most sources, from March 2003 to December of 2011. And what's interesting about this conflict and what lends itself to controversy is a few different things. One is there were no traces of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons ever found. So the whole premise of the invasion was that Saddam Hussein wasn't cooperating with UN sanctions and that he was developing a weapons of mass destruction, but those were never found. So that lends itself to the continuous controversy of this war. The other controversy is that we remain involved. President Obama, his presidency, it's early yet, but his presidency tended to get a high ranking because of the lack of scandal, and his goal, two primary goals of his presidency were to provide more health care, which he did, and to try and end two wars. But he had difficulty doing that. He does pull troops out of Iraq, but he has to send them back in 2014 because of continuous instability that occurs there. So President Obama ordered troops back into Iraq in 2014 due to advances by the Islamic State. Okay, the Islamic State is a radical Islamist state seeking to control portions of the Middle East, remove the Middle East of foreign influence. Trump has promised. Trump constantly criticizes involvement in endless wars, and he's tried to pull troops out, but he has maintained a U.S. presence in Iraq. Okay, so the point is these two conflicts are ongoing. Okay, and that lends it to their controversy. U.S. casualties, according to some sources I looked up recently, 4,489 deaths, 30,000 injuries. But look at what the involvement has done to the Iraqi people. 115,000 to 500,000 to over 1 million, depending on what source you read. Now, there are arguably good things that come about from our involvements, right? Saddam Hussein was a dictator. Right now in Iraq, there is a parliamentary democracy led by Adel Abdul Mahdi, who's actually the president. So there is voting in Iraq now, although the forces of opposition there are trying to make it tough on people to vote. Let's look at Afghanistan. So I'm going back to Afghanistan for a moment. I thought it'd be good to, since these conflicts are ongoing, to just kind of do the consequences at the end of this lecture. 2001 to present, still kind of involved, right? Not as much as we were, but still things going on. 3,500 U.S. deaths, 20,000 wounded, 157,000 Afghanistan people killed, 43,000 of those are civilians. There's been 10,000 casualties a year in that country since the United States has entered it. Okay, there were 10,000 casualties last year, 2019. There was a breakdown in public health, security, and infrastructure that initially occurred. Some of that has been built back up, but conflict continues. We have tried to create a republic there, so our involvements do try to spread democracy. There's a republic there currently. Let me click on this really quick and see if there's an update of okay, so here's what we've got, and forgive me for this, kids, I'm almost done. So according to InfoPlease, Afghanistan is governed under the Constitution of 2004. The president is the head of state and of government, popularly elected for a 5-year term. Okay, president appoints a cabinet. You have a lower house, which is directly elected, and then you have an upper house, which is appointed by provincial councils. So the upper house isn't directly elected. That's how we did our Senate originally. They were chosen by state legislatures. Now our Senate is directly elected. So it looks like they've got a government that is modeled largely on ours, right? This is interesting, though. Half of whom, a third elected by district councils to 3-year terms, and the rest, half of whom must be women. I found that interesting. Appointed by a president to 5-year terms. No law passed by the assembly may be contrary to Islam. So that's interesting. So not exactly a separation of church and state there. Okay. And I need to update that president there. It's not Hamid Karzai anymore. I forgot to do that, but I'm not going to start this over now. I'll update that in one of the comments when we talk about it, kids. I don't believe it's Hamid Karzai anymore. I believe that's who was originally appointed. So that's, and actually that might be what I meant to state there, that the first president of Afghanistan will be Hamid Karzai. Okay, the Iraq and Afghan wars will cost, according to a Harvard study, about $4 to $6 trillion. So there are some goods that come out of this conflict. You know, the attempted spread of democracy, the creation of republics in these regions. That was Bush's goals, you know. But there is some criticism of it because of its ongoing conflict. The amount of civilians killed, U.S. soldiers killed, things like that. And there are some other things that occur in these conflicts that I can't get into now due to time permitting. So the reason why I'm trying to bring up a little bit of both sides here is these are two conflicts that you could choose for your last essay, and you could decide to argue, should the United States have gotten involved in Afghanistan or should they not have? Should the United States have gotten involved in Iraq or should they not have? Another one I mentioned in this lecture was Clinton's involvement in Kosovo. Should the United States have gotten involved there? That's one that people usually argue they should have, but there are some that argue not. So those are some choices that are made. Hopefully this lecture helped you with that. I'm going to stop there. There are other things I could deal with, like the Great Recession of '08. But since your last essay deals with foreign policy, I think this is a good spot to end it. As always, kids, I appreciate your attention with these lectures. Make sure you ask a key question or post a comment on Google Classroom. Thank you for your attention to all my lectures this year, kids. I appreciate it.